For nearly a decade, no one inside the UFC felt safe when the lights dimmed and the name Anderson Silva echoed through the arena. He wasn't just a champion, he was a phenomenon, a fighter whose timing, precision, and creativity pushed mixed martial arts into an entirely new era. With 17 consecutive UFC wins, 10 title defenses, and highlight reels that looked impossible even in slow motion, he became the man other fighters studied, feared, and tried, always unsuccessfully, to decode. To millions, Anderson Silva wasn't just the greatest middleweight of all time. He was the closest thing MMA ever had to perfection. But perfection has a price. And the higher a fighter rises, the darker the shadows behind him become. Beneath the brilliance were controversies the UFC struggled to manage, testing issues that ignited global debate, rivalries that became personal wars, and a devastating injury that nearly ended his career in one instant. The world adored the legend, but few understood the chaos surrounding him, or the pressure of carrying a sport that desperately needed him. So the question is, how did Anderson Silva become the UFC's greatest champion, and still end up trapped inside scandals that threatened to erase everything he built? To answer that, we must go back to where the legend began. Long before the bright lights, before the title belts, before the world started calling him the Spider. Long before he became the man the world feared, Anderson Silva was just a skinny kid in Sao Paulo, Brazil, growing up in a neighborhood where most people learned to survive before they learned to dream. Raised in a working-class family, he didn't have the advantages future champions usually rely on. No elite gyms, no sponsorships, no roadmap into greatness. What he did have was curiosity, discipline, and an instinctive understanding of movement that coaches would later call unnatural. By the time he was a teenager, he had already immersed himself in Taekwondo, Muay Thai, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, showing a level of precision and timing far beyond his age. What set him apart wasn't power or aggression, it was the way he saw combat. While others trained to hit harder, Anderson trained to see what others missed. The angles, the rhythm, the split-second windows where the human body betrays itself. That unique vision became the foundation of everything he would later build. By his early 20s, he was already fighting professionally across Brazil, collecting victories in a way that made local promoters whisper that the quiet kid might be something rare. But the true test came when Anderson Silva stepped onto the global stage in pride and cage rage, facing opponents with reputations far louder than his own. Instead of being overwhelmed, he made them look predictable. His performances were clean, calculated, sometimes cold. The early blueprint of the fighter who would later redefine striking in MMA. His knockout of Tony Freiklund, delivered by a perfectly placed upward elbow, was so creative it looked choreographed. His win streak in cage rage showed the world he wasn't just talented, he was inevitable. Yet the moment that changed everything was when he entered the UFC in 2006. Few newcomers had ever arrived with such little hype, yet such overwhelming impact. In his debut, he dismantled Chris Lieben in 49 seconds, a clinical destruction that made analysts question whether they were witnessing the rise of a once-in-a-generation talent. Weeks later, he stepped into the cage with Rich Franklin, the reigning middleweight king, and dismantled him with brutal precision, capturing the UFC middleweight championship and announcing the beginning of an era the sport was not prepared for. From that point forward, Anderson didn't climb. He levitated. His 17-fight UFC win streak, the longest in the promotion's history, became the stuff of legend. His rematches, his title defenses, his iconic finishes against Vitor Belfort, Forrest Griffin, and Chael Sonnen turned him into a global icon. Fans didn't just watch his fights, they studied them. Opponents didn't just fear his power, they feared the silence before he struck. But even as the world embraced the myth of Anderson Silva, something else was forming in the background. Something far more unpredictable than any opponent he had ever faced. Because the higher a fighter rises, the farther he has to fall. And the scandals waiting ahead would test not only his legacy, but the loyalty of the entire UFC, as Anderson Silva rose higher than any fighter the UFC had ever promoted. The weight of perfection began pressing against him from every direction. But the first cracks in the legend didn't come from a punch. They came from behavior no one expected from a champion. His style inside the octagon, once celebrated as artistic brilliance, started veering into something riskier. He dropped his hands, taunted opponents, and dared them to hit him, turning fights into performances that blurred the line between confidence and disrespect. In the eyes of millions, it was genius. In the eyes of critics, it was arrogance waiting to collapse. That collapse arrived violently in 2013 when Chris Weidman ended Silva's historic streak with a knockout that stunned the world. The image of Anderson lying unconscious, the man who once felt untouchable, instantly shattered the aura he had spent 7 years building. But the real shock came 6 months later in the rematch, when Silva's leg snapped in a moment so gruesome that broadcasters refused to replay it. The injury became more than a physical disaster. It became the turning point that raised new questions. How fast could a 38-year-old champion truly recover? And what would he do to speed the process? Those questions exploded in 2015 when Anderson Silva failed a drug test ahead of UFC 183, showing metabolites of drostanolone and androsterone, substances banned under athletic regulations. Although Silva denied intentional use and claimed contamination, the damage to his reputation was immediate and devastating. Analysts who once called him the greatest fighter alive now questioned every knockout, every comeback, every moment that once seemed superhuman. The Nevada Athletic Commission suspended him for 1 year, and the scandal became one of the darkest chapters of his career. But testing issues weren't his only controversy. His rivalry with Chael Sonnen escalated far beyond the octagon, filled with accusations, personal attacks, and media headlines that reshaped Silva from a quiet martial artist into a lightning rod for MMA drama. Sonnen exposed vulnerabilities, not just in Silva's game, but in his public image, painting him as a champion protected by the UFC and shielded from consequences. Whether true or not, the narrative infected fans' perception, adding fuel to the fire every time Silva stumbled. There were also whispers inside gyms, disputes over training camps, disagreements with coaches, conflicts over sparring partners. Stories that added to the growing idea that Anderson was no longer the disciplined, laser-focused artist he once had been. As he aged, losses multiplied, and testing scrutiny tightened. The myth of the spider began colliding with the reality of a fighter facing time, pressure, and expectations no human could sustain forever. The scandals didn't erase his greatness, but they stained the perfection people believed in. And with each controversy, the UFC found itself in a delicate balancing act: defend its legend or distance itself from the chaos surrounding him. That tension would become even more complicated once money entered the equation. Because Anderson Silva wasn't just a champion, he was a multi-million-dollar empire the UFC couldn't afford to lose. Long before the scandals reshaped his image, Anderson Silva had already become one of the highest-paid athletes in UFC history, a fighter whose economic impact rippled far beyond the numbers disclosed to the public. What most fans never realized is that Silva was not just a champion, he was a financial engine, a brand whose presence could raise PPV buys, elevate Brazilian markets, and expand the UFC into territories it had struggled to penetrate for years. By the peak of his career, Anderson was earning $600,000 to $1 million per fight, not including discretionary bonuses the UFC rarely disclosed. But the real source of wealth came from PPV points, a privilege reserved only for the elite. When Silva fought stars like Chael Sonnen, Vitor Belfort, or Chris Weidman, the events routinely surpassed 600,000 to 1 million PPV buys, numbers that placed him alongside icons such as Georges St-Pierre and Brock Lesnar. To the UFC, Anderson wasn't just profitable, he was essential. Each of his fights represented millions in global revenue. And then there was Brazil. As the UFC expanded aggressively into South America, Anderson became the face of an entire movement. Brazilian broadcasters paid premium prices to secure his fights. Corporate sponsors lined up: Nike, Burger King, Beats by Dre, and local powerhouse brands poured money into campaigns featuring the Spider. His endorsement income at one point exceeded $5 million per year, making him one of the most commercially valuable fighters on the planet. Outside the cage, Anderson built a mini-empire. Restaurants, training academies, realistics like Tapped Out, Hell's Chain, and the Expendables franchise. Each venture solidified him not only as an athlete, but as a global celebrity whose influence extended far beyond MMA. By conservative estimates, his career earnings and business ventures together pushed his total value into the tens of millions, a level of financial independence few fighters ever achieve. This economic power created an unusual dynamic inside the UFC. Anderson wasn't just another athlete under contract. He was a brand the organization depended on, especially between 2006 and 2013. Without him, Brazilian viewership dropped. Without him, PPV numbers dipped. Without him, the UFC lost one of its most marketable faces. And that is where the tension began to surface. As Anderson grew wealthier and more influential, the UFC found itself navigating a relationship unlike any it had before. How do you discipline a fighter who generates millions? How do you manage scandals when the athlete involved is responsible for entire global markets? The truth is simple. You don't control a fighter like Anderson Silva. You negotiate around him. And that fragile balance became even more visible once the world started questioning whether the UFC needed him, or whether the UFC had become too dependent on him to function without him. Behind the dazzling knockouts and the global fame, Anderson Silva lived a life far more complex than the legend millions believed in. Those who knew him understood that the Spider, the cold, unblinking, almost supernatural presence inside the octagon, was only one half of the man. Outside the cage, Anderson was soft-spoken, philosophical, even sentimental. He spent long evenings at home with his family in Los Angeles or Curitiba, cooking meals, listening to music, and trying to remain grounded, while the world insisted on lifting him to mythic heights. But living as a global icon came with a different kind of pressure, the kind that stalks a fighter when the cameras turn off. Anderson was often torn between two identities: the martial artist who valued humility and respect, and the superstar whose every move was broadcast across continents. Fame reshaped friendships, complicated trust, and created a quiet distance between him and the world he once knew. People looked at him and saw greatness. Very few looked at him and saw Anderson, the man who wrestled with doubt, loneliness, and the fragile awareness that athletic careers never last forever. His family became both his anchor and his vulnerability. Anderson was deeply protective of them, shielding them from the harsh realities of his profession. Yet the more famous he became, the more scrutiny fell on his personal life. Stories of internal disagreements, business strain, and the emotional burden of carrying a country's expectations every time he stepped into the cage. Being a hero in Brazil wasn't just an honor, it was a responsibility that followed him into every interview, every public appearance, every second of his training camps. Even his relationship with his craft grew more complicated over time. Early in his career, fighting was expression, a dance between instinct and creativity. But as the years passed, it became obligation. He fought not just to earn, but to maintain a legacy, to satisfy fans, to answer critics, to keep the UFC machine running. The sport he once loved with purity slowly transformed into a battlefield of expectations, where any mistake could become a headline, any loss a global conversation. Then came the psychological aftershocks of the Weidman injury, the drug test scandal, and declining performances. Anderson was no longer just fighting opponents. He was fighting the public's memory of who he used to be. Each return to the cage felt heavier, loaded with questions about whether he was chasing redemption or running from a reality he didn't want to face. Yet, through it all, one truth remained. Anderson Silva was never just an athlete. He was an artist, a father, a husband, a dreamer, a man who carried fame with grace, but carried pressure with silence. And that silence revealed something deeper about his story, something the UFC understood better than anyone else. Because behind every great fighter is a truth promotions rarely admit. Some athletes become so important that losing them isn't an option. And Anderson Silva was one of the few fighters the UFC feared losing more than any title belt they ever created. At the height of his reign, Anderson Silva wasn't just a champion inside the UFC. He was a structure the organization relied on, a pillar so critical that losing him would have shaken the company's global momentum. To understand this fear, you have to understand what Silva represented. He was not simply the middleweight champion. He was a market, a movement, and a financial guarantee rolled into one man. He anchored entire PPV cards, boosted international expansion, and carried the kind of star power reserved for names like Georges St-Pierre, Conor McGregor, and Brock Lesnar. One of the biggest reasons the UFC feared losing him was regional dominance. Brazil, one of the UFC's most lucrative markets, practically revolved around Anderson during his prime. TV networks paid premiums when he fought. Stadium events sold out in hours, and sponsors followed him with the eagerness usually reserved for soccer giants. Without Anderson, the UFC risked losing tens of millions in broadcasting revenue and a cultural foothold in a country that viewed him as a national hero. Then there was his global appeal. Anderson didn't fight like anyone else. His movement, his precision, the way he ended fights with a single counterpunch or a perfectly timed kick. These elements made him the UFC's most watchable champion. Fans who didn't know the sport still knew Anderson Silva. Casual viewers tuned in not for matchups, but for moments. And Anderson delivered them with frightening consistency. The organization understood that you cannot manufacture a fighter like that. You can only hope to keep him. This is why the UFC treated him differently during conflicts and scandals. When testing issues emerged, the organization walked a tightrope. Enforce rules, but avoid destroying the star who carried so much of the company's value. When he lost fights, they didn't push him out. They promoted his comebacks, framing him as a legend, a living monument, someone whose presence was more important than his win-loss record. Even late in his career, when younger contenders were rising, the UFC continued booking him in high-profile matchups because they knew something simple but undeniable. Anderson Silva still sold fights. And beyond economics, there was legacy. Anderson was the fighter casual fans pointed to when asked what MMA really looked like at its highest level. He elevated the sport aesthetically, turning fights into art, knockouts into poetry, reactions into global trends. Losing him wouldn't just hurt business, it would hurt the identity of the UFC at a time when the brand was still fighting for mainstream legitimacy. So the fear wasn't really about losing a champion, it was about losing a symbol, a figure who proved that MMA wasn't just violence, but mastery, not just chaos, but creativity. Someone who turned the octagon into a canvas and forced the world to admit that mixed martial arts could be as breathtaking as any sport ever created. That's why the UFC protected him, elevated him, and relied on him for so many years. Because fighters like Anderson Silva don't come twice, and when they fade, an entire organization is forced to confront a question it never wants to answer. What happens when your greatest icon is no longer there to carry you? When the story of Anderson Silva is finally told in full, it will never fit neatly into the box of greatest fighter or most controversial champion. His legacy is broader, heavier, more complicated than any single label could ever capture. He was a man who transformed striking into choreography, who broke records the UFC once believed unbreakable, and who carried the sport on his shoulders during years when MMA was still fighting for global legitimacy. His highlight reel became the standard. His instincts became the blueprint. His dominance became the myth future champions would spend their lives chasing. But greatness is rarely clean. For every moment of brilliance, there were shadows. The testing issues, the tension with critics, the loss of aura after Chris Weidman, and the long, painful road back from injuries that would have ended most careers. Yet those fractures, those mistakes, those human moments are part of what makes his story unforgettable. Because legends aren't defined by a perfect climb. They're defined by how deeply they shape the world around them. And Anderson Silva shaped MMA more profoundly than any fighter of his generation. Even now, long after the streak, long after the belt, long after the sport moved on to new stars, the question he leaves behind still lingers. Was the UFC built stronger because of Anderson Silva? Or did it rise on his back in ways the world never fully understood? What cannot be denied is this. The UFC before Anderson and the UFC after Anderson are two different worlds. The sport evolved because he forced it to evolve. And whether fans remember him for the genius, the scandals, the heartbreak, or the impossible victories, one truth will always rise above the noise. Fighters like him appear once in a lifetime. And when they're gone, the entire sport has to catch its breath and ask itself a question it is never ready for. Who could possibly replace Anderson Silva?